Stand with me for a second, right on the precipice of July 1953. The guns across the Korean Peninsula are finally falling silent. But, this was never a true victory. As President Harry S. Truman warned at the time, they had won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world. We almost always think of wars ending with a definitive treaty, right? A clear winner, a clear loser. But what happens when a war just pauses? Well, today we're diving into a conflict that didn't actually end. It just held its breath. Welcome to This Explainer. We're going to treat this not as some dusty sequence of dates in a textbook, but as a living, breathing historical thriller. We'll be exploring how the grueling, deeply human reality of the negotiations at a place called Panmunjom didn't just hit the pause button on a war 70 years ago, but literally continues to dictate the fragile global security of our world today. Okay, put yourself in the room. It's July 27th, 1953. We are inside these hastily constructed wooden buildings at Panmunjom, sitting right on the freshly inked Korean Demilitarized Zone. The atmosphere in this sweltering room is just suffocatingly tense. Absolute silence. You can practically feel the bitter disdain between the two sides. U.S. Army Lieutenant General William Harrison Jr. and North Korean General Nam Il are sitting at completely separate tables. They don't speak to each other. They don't even shake hands. For 10 straight minutes, the only sound you hear is the scratching of pens, signing 18 copies of an agreement in 3 different languages. It's an armistice, a ceasefire. But how on earth did we get to this silent, intensely hostile room? Let's get into Section 1, a truce built on tension. We really need to shatter the myth that this outcome was somehow quick or inevitable. The road to that silent room was paved with this agonizing diplomatic wrangling, where every single word negotiated carried a literal body count. Just look at the staggering gap in time here. 2 entire years between the start of negotiations in 1951 and the final signature in 1953. The battle lines had already stabilized near the 38th parallel by the spring of 51, which essentially rendered the military reality a total stalemate. And yet, the meat grinder just kept turning. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers continued to die in the mud and the cold. So you have to ask, why? What force could possibly keep this going when both sides had already agreed to sit down at the table?
That brings us to Section 2, the prisoner exchange dilemma.
This right here was the most painful chapter of the entire conflict. A dilemma that wasn't just about drawing lines on a map, but about the fate of captive human beings. On one side, you have the U.S. and the UN, led by figures like Secretary of State Dean Acheson, demanding voluntary repatriation, basically the fundamental right for a prisoner to choose if they want to go back. On the other side, the communist bloc was uncompromisingly rigid. Their demand? Involuntary repatriation. Everyone goes back, period. I mean, just imagine being an individual captive in one of those camps. You are terrified. Your survival, your freedom, or your forced return to a brutal regime hinges entirely on this massive geopolitical chess match playing out hundreds of miles away. And the psychological and political toll this took on global leaders was immense. President Truman actually later wrote this incredibly revealing line, "It was here that the most serious wrangling began, and it was here also that I insisted that we could not give ground." The leaders of the free world were looking at horrific daily casualty rates on the battlefield, but they absolutely refused to compromise on the human rights of those prisoners. It was without a doubt a staggering moral and strategic gamble.
Well, eventually, this stalemate broke, and it led to Operations Little Switch and Big Switch in the spring and summer of 1953. Little Switch saw the exchange of the sick and wounded, while Big Switch was the final exchange of the remaining POWs. Try to picture the sheer, overwhelming tension of those days. Convoys of broken, exhausted men finally crossing a physical line in the dirt back to their respective sides. It was the ultimate human payoff after 2 years of diplomatic bloodletting over their very souls.
Moving on to Section 3, strategic divergence among allies. Now, behind closed doors, these alliances were fracturing from within. We usually assume unified fronts in war, but the reality here was bitter division. The United States and the UN were just exhausted. They were ready to end hostilities and essentially settle for the status quo. But South Korea's president, Syngman Rhee, he fiercely resisted. To him, an armistice leaving the peninsula permanently divided wasn't peace at all. It was a death sentence for a unified Korea. He wanted to fight on, and all the while, the communist bloc constantly shifted their goals just to test the UN's resolve. This is exactly where cold geopolitical calculations violently collided with a nation's desperate fight for survival.
Which leads us to Section 4, the strategy that never ended.
The deep fault lines driven between allies back in those sweltering tents of 1953? Yeah, they didn't just evaporate when the ink dried. They actually became the blueprint for a war that is still being fought right now. For decades, North Korea has heavily promoted what they call the three principles of reunification: independence, peace, national solidarity. I mean, read those words. They sound completely benign, don't they? They sound like a perfectly reasonable, diplomatic approach to healing a divided nation. But in the context of this specific conflict, language is literally a weapon. So let's actually deconstruct that facade. When you peel back the nice rhetorical packaging, you find a highly coercive geopolitical playbook. Step 1. Drive a wedge between Seoul and Washington, which, by the way, exploits the exact same tension we just talked about between Truman and Syngman Rhee in 1953. Step 2. Cultivate pro-Pyongyang sentiment within South Korea. And Step 3. Use that momentum to engineer the total withdrawal of U.S. forces from the peninsula. North Korea's modern strategy relies entirely on exploiting the historical fractures that were first exposed during those armistice negotiations. Take the term Panmunjom de Daniel, or Grand National Unity. This slogan has been deployed widely since the 1970s, but intelligence analysts and political scientists are quick to note that this isn't some genuine invitation to a peaceful dialogue, not at all. It is a precision-engineered instrument of political warfare perfectly designed to frame South Korea's alliances as toxic foreign interference. It just goes to show how language itself has been weaponized as a continuation of the Korean War by other means. You might wonder, why do institutions like the National Museum of the Marine Corps meticulously preserve the memory and the brutal reality of the Korean War? Well, it's because the men and women who lived it understand a really chilling truth. The war didn't end. It simply entered a highly militarized state of suspended animation. The lessons of 1953, the massive cost of deterrence, the fragility of alliances, and the reality of dealing with the coercive adversaries, they aren't confined to glass display cases. They are active, highly volatile variables in our world today. So, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. If the strategic wedges driven between allies in the bloody mud of 1953 are still the exact foundation of North Korea's playbook today, just how close is the world to the sudden, catastrophic collapse of this 70-year truce? This is not a forgotten war, guys. It is a war waiting in the shadows. Keep questioning the history that shapes our present, and we'll see you next time.